Created in the 1940s by two Jewish men as a response to the threat posed by the Axis powers, Captain America, if his name didn't make it obvious, has always been a political figure. Blazing onto the page in December of 1940, a full year before the United States entered World War II, Captain America Comics made a bold statement. The world was at war, and Americans could not sit idly by. As the decades passed, however, and the United States moved from the obvious enemies of World War II to the more nuanced political issues of the 60s and early 70s, the depiction of these conflicts within Captain America comic books became similarly complex. Thanks to their serialized nature, Captain America comics act as a fascinating time capsule from this period of American history, demonstrating in basically real time how various conflicts, including the Vietnam War and Watergate, called the patriotism of both America's ordinary citizens and her superheroic champions into question. Today, let's examine how the Captain America comics of writers like Stan Lee and Steve Englehart engaged with the social issues that dominated the 60s and 70s, and see if they can give us any insight into the changing public opinion of American society. In order to fully appreciate Captain America's history as a political figure, we need to start by taking a look at his origins. Created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, two Jewish comics legends during the 1940s, early Captain America comics have an obvious political leaning. While artist Jack Kirby described himself as relatively apolitical during this period, this stance had one key exception: Nazis. In a 1990 interview, Kirby recalled, "I was a young man. The only real politics I knew was that if a guy liked Hitler, I'd beat the stuffing out of him." This sentiment carried over to Simon and Kirby's work at Timely Comics. Published in December of 1940, Captain America Comics was one of the first superhero comics to feature Adolf Hitler and his Nazi soldiers as explicit, recurring enemies. Throughout this initial run, Steve Rogers has no qualms about meeting the threat of Nazis with deadly force. Characterizing these early comics, Stan Taylor writes,
"Cap was not a cop. He was created to destroy this evil, to wipe it off the face of this earth. His job was to effect an almost biblical retribution on those who would destroy us. Captain America was an elemental remedy to a primal malevolence."
This explicitly political stance made Captain America an exceptionally popular hero with both civilian readers and GIs abroad. After the Nazis were defeated, however, the character's popularity waned until his title was eventually canceled in the 1950s. As an aside, this is really a very brief overview of Cap's origins. If you want a great and in-depth look at the politics of Captain America comics, check out NerdSync's video. Scott has been a big inspiration for what I'm trying to do here, so I'll be sure to link his video down in the description. Over a decade later, Stan Lee chose to reintroduce the character of Captain America by pairing him up with the newly formed Avengers. Taking the character from the America he recognized to one which was so changed, so different, and which would only become even more complicated over the following decade, Lee's Captain America stories give readers a clear view of his own attitudes towards the issues of the day. So now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at Stan Lee's comics and how they reflect the changing attitudes of the period. We can start by examining Cap's involvement in the conflict that would come to define the 60s and 70s, the Vietnam War. Or really, let's examine Cap's lack of involvement, because from 1964 to 1970, Captain America only appears in Vietnam 2 times. The first was in October of 1964, 5 months prior to the arrival of the first American ground troops in Vietnam. And at first, this seems to line up with the way Joe Simon's original comics made bold declarations, how they outlined the enemies of America. If Cap is going to war, then so should the country he represents, right? But in reality, Stan Lee's recently revived Captain America is far more hesitant to make any prescriptive statements about America's involvement in Vietnam. As Howe notes in his book, Marvel Comics: The Untold Story,
Stan Lee's middle-of-the-road liberalism was, in its own way, unmovable. He'd happily preach tolerance, but he was not going to get caught taking an unpopular stance.
We can see this just by comparing the covers of Captain America Comics number 1 and Tales of Suspense number 61. In his very first appearance, Captain America takes an active stance against the Nazis. In the bottom left corner is a map of the United States and a folder labeled Sabotage Plans for USA, while in the center of the frame, Cap is ready to fight to protect the United States as he punches Adolf Hitler in the face. Comics are a lot of things, but subtle is not one of them. Captain America number 1 makes it abundantly clear who the threat is and how any good American should deal with them. In contrast, Lee's Tales of Suspense number 61 takes a much more guarded approach. With his shield raised to block a bullet, Captain America calls out, "Hold your fire. Can't you see I'm unarmed?" Unlike the active stance of Simon's Captain America, Lee's Steve Rogers is on the defensive from the very beginning. Even Lee's authorial voice seems reluctant to take a firm stand, describing Captain America as the last person the communist Viet Cong expect to see. While Simon repeatedly demonstrates a firm commitment to his political beliefs, Lee is slower to take a hardline stance. Using his cover in this way, from the framing of the characters, to their dialogue, to the narration, it's obvious that Lee doesn't really want to engage in support or criticism of his country's actions. Now you might be thinking, just because the cover doesn't take a firm stand, does that really mean the whole comic is afraid to commit? Don't we need to know how the story engages with Vietnam? And you'd be right. To find out, we'll have to take a look inside and compare what we find to both Captain America's past war stories and typical depictions of Vietnam. Writing for the Kirby Effect, Stan Taylor argues that in the 1940s, because Captain America was facing the very real threat of the Nazis, the crimes of his villains had to be realistically evil, rather than just theatrical scene chewing. They had to feel like a threat because they were a threat. By the time we get to Captain America's first clash in Vietnam, Lee's story and Kirby's art make the conflict seem cartoonish. Drawn by Jack Kirby, Tales of Suspense number 61 portrays a Vietnam that is surprisingly clear and open. Captain America regularly stands against clear blue skies instead of the thick jungles we'd usually expect. And I won't deny that this might be a choice of convenience. It's probably easier to draw and print a clear blue background rather than a dark jungle. But it's still one that goes against our expectations of what the Vietnam War is supposed to look like. Speaking to these expectations in his article, The Vietnam War, Not a Space for Superheroes, Bjorn Hochschild writes,
The Vietnam War is usually staged as an impenetrable and unfathomable space, inhabited by a completely invisible and depersonalized enemy moving as a mass of guerrilla soldiers.
Lee and Kirby's Vietnam is not impenetrable, it's not unfathomable, and the enemies we meet there aren't guerrilla soldiers. While the comic does call them Viet Cong and communist, their depiction is far from typical. When Captain America finally meets the comic's main villain, the General, he's not met with a faceless, hidden enemy, but a massive sumo wrestler. Dwarfed in size, Captain America must face a warrior who appears to be his physical equal. At one point, when the General has Cap pinned, he yells, "I am twice your size, 3 times your weight. To me, you are no more than a bothersome flea." The pure physicality of the General, his massive size and combat prowess, really disrupts our typical understanding of Vietnam. The Viet Cong, according to Lee and Kirby, aren't resisting a superior power through guerrilla tactics. They're able to meet Captain America and the country he represents head-on. By depicting Vietnam in this way, Lee and Kirby's comic shows at best a lack of familiarity with the conflict, and at worst an inability to understand the true toll of war. Now, if Captain America only makes 2 appearances in Vietnam, the first in 1964, and the second not until 6 years later in 1970, I can't help but wonder, what was he doing for all that time? The answer is that after this first appearance in Vietnam, Lee's Captain America comics become suspiciously retrospective. Issue 63 to 74 of Tales of Suspense choose not to focus on current conflicts, but to retell the origins of Steve Rogers. And this decision does two things. The first is practical. By retelling his origin story, Lee allows new readers who may not have grown up with Cap's World War II adventures to learn how the Sentinel of Liberty got his start. With the introduction of Vita rays to Cap's origins, Lee modernizes the character, bringing him into the atomic age, while also allowing him to keep one foot planted firmly in the past. And this actually brings us to the second thing this choice does, which is it allows both writer and reader to not have to focus on the complicated conflict of a war like Vietnam. Instead, they can direct their attention to a nice, simple war, one with clear heroes and villains. With the reintroduction of the Red Skull and the creation of Baron Zemo, Captain America comics from the late 60s continue this push for a simple past, in which the US was a force for good against the Nazi threat. For even more evidence, look no further than the title page that begins every single Captain America story from this era, starting with Tales of Suspense number 69, and continuing through the book's final issue. Every comic is introduced with the same subtitle: Captain America, Living Legend of World War II. This isn't just a classic piece of Stan Lee alliteration, although, seriously, the creator of Bruce Banner, Peter Parker, Reed Richards, Sue Storm, Robbie Robertson, and more absolutely adored alliteration. Instead, it's surprisingly important to understanding the purpose of Cap's stories in this time period. As a living legend, Captain America both exists in the present day of the late 60s and calls back to a simpler time, one with a simple narrative of altruistic American power during World War II. He's not just a man. He's a legend, a symbol, a clear representation of American moral righteousness now being written in a time when who's good and who's bad had become far less obvious. However, this choice didn't sit well with all of Marvel's readers, and we can see this dissatisfaction in the letters column. Comics Tropes has a great video about the history of the letters column that I'll link in the description, but for now you can basically think of it as a Reddit thread or a YouTube comment section from before the existence of the internet. It was a place you'd go to talk with creators, write about what you wanted to see in upcoming issues, or, if your Reddit comments look anything like mine, to argue with other fans. In his article, Let's Rap with Cap, Redefining American Patriotism Through Popular Discourse and Letters, J. Richard Stevens explores the patriotism controversy, a long-standing debate between comics fans that discussed and ultimately influenced how the character of Captain America would tackle the issues of the day. In the letter that sparked the controversy, Albert Rodriguez lays out some of the concerns with the more conservative Cap Lee had been writing up until this point, calling Steve Rogers a defender of the establishment, arguing that the comic should stop calling back to the past, and ultimately concluding that it would fit the standards of today if Captain America were more liberal. Conservative readers pushed back against these ideas, but friends of the Marvel bullpen like Steve Gerber agreed with Rodriguez, and they influenced Lee enough to move the book further left. Responding to the controversy directly in February of 1970, Lee addressed the concerns of readers in Captain America number 122, writing, "We don't feel that it is good for us as a nation to be certain that we are in all respects the greatest country in the world. We don't think the US is perfect, not by a long shot, but what's important now is that we're trying to make it better." This shift is also reflected in the story. The Captain America we see at this point is brooding, angsty, wondering if he still has a place in the modern day. Published in October of 1970, Captain America number 130 follows Steve Rogers as he grapples with exactly this question. Traveling on his motorcycle, he comes across a student riot on a college campus. While the reason for the protest is never given, I don't think it's a stretch to say that contemporary readers would have been able to connect the dots between this imagery and the anti-war movement. After attempting to break up fighting between students and police, Cap is thanked for standing up for law and order, language that mirrors the rhetoric of Richard Nixon, by a man who turns out to be the story's villain, hoping to use Nixon's rhetoric to make Americans distrust their own younger generation. The villain asks Steve to give a speech defending America's institutions. And here's where we really see Lee decide that his book needs to make a statement. Cap disagrees with the villain's point, and instead tells his audience, this nation was founded by dissidents, by people who wanted something better. There's nothing sacred about the status quo, and there never will be. Drawing upon America's revolutionary history, Cap is no longer a defender of the status quo. Instead, he can use his status as a man out of time to criticize the problems of the present using the ideals of the past. Influenced by the world around him and the changing opinions of readers, by 1970, Stan Lee's attitudes had changed as well, and the contents of his comics followed suit. Bringing us back to Cap's second venture into Vietnam, we can see that this excursion, 5 years into American troops' involvement in the ground war, features a much more serious depiction of the conflict. In Captain America number 125, Rogers goes to Vietnam not to rescue an American soldier who was captured by communist enemies, but to find a missing doctor who went to help the sick, the wounded, of both sides. He's not there to ensure an overwhelming American victory, but to help the innocent. Artist Gene Colan's depiction of the country is also far different from that of Jack Kirby. Captured in 3 thin panels and surrounded by dense foliage, which obscures most of Captain America's body, Colan's Vietnam is one filled with claustrophobia, darkness, and death, or as Steve puts it, the senseless sound of battle, the endless toll of death, a spent and suffering land. These more realistic aesthetics are complemented by more realistic combat. Gone is the massive sumo wrestler, replaced by a hidden sniper, unforgiving terrain, and trench warfare. As the story reaches its climax, it's revealed that the real enemy is neither the southern nor northern Vietnamese forces, but the Mandarin, a warlord who simply wants to heighten tensions between both sides so that he can rule the ashes. By 1970, Captain America's fight is no longer a cartoonish battle, but a conflict without clear enemies. It's a representation of how Lee's shifting attitudes toward the Vietnam War and his renewed understanding of Captain America's place in the modern world shaped his comics. But it's also worth remembering that Stan Lee wasn't the only writer to work on Captain America in the 70s, and he wasn't the only one to engage with political issues. And that brings us to if Stan Lee's changing politics gradually shifted the politics of Captain America, then Steve Englehart's run on the character, beginning in September of 1972, radically altered the comic's approach to discussing current events. Sean Howe describes the change by writing,
Steve Englehart, who'd buried his best friend from basic training, marinated the stories he wrote in lefty politics, where Stan Lee, a master fence-sitter, had managed to always stake out a safe middle ground. Englehart couldn't help but have stronger and angrier convictions.
As the 1970s wore on, and crises such as the ongoing war in Vietnam and Watergate rocked the nation, Englehart felt compelled to use his medium to respond. Describing his work later in life, Englehart said, "I was writing Captain America, and I thought, there's no way Captain America could not react to something this momentous in America if the Marvel Universe was supposed to be the real universe." With his 1974 storyline, Secret Empire, Englehart decided to do just that. In a series of clear parallels to Watergate, Cap is publicly humiliated by the Committee to Regain America's Principles, an obvious reference to Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President, who are led by ad exec Quentin Harderman, a name and career that bear a not-so-subtle resemblance to former ad man and Richard Nixon's Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman. As Captain America works his way towards foiling the Secret Empire's plans, The comic's most shocking political commentary comes at its climax. Captain America chases the villainous Number One, leader of the Secret Empire and mastermind of its criminal conspiracy, from the White House lawn to the Oval Office, and unmasks him. His face obscured from the reader's view, a shocked Steve Rogers looks at Number One and exclaims, "Good Lord, you're..." To which Number One responds, "Exactly. But high political office didn't satisfy me. My power was still too constrained by legalities." Dude, you get it? He's meant to be Richard Nixon. Anyway, after legally distinct Richard Nixon turns his weapon on himself, Captain America walks out of the White House, finding himself, like millions of other Americans, disillusioned with the government he once believed in. Giving up the role of Captain America, Steve calls everything that he fought for a cynical sham. Once again, comics are not good because they're subtle. Here, Englehart is using his medium to speak to the real issues that the American people were grappling with, most notably, a crumbling trust in their institutions. Through the conclusion to Secret Empire, Englehart's Cap, once the purest representation of American idealism, now reflects the cynicism that Americans felt in the wake of Watergate. However, just because he's done being Captain America, that doesn't mean that Steve Rogers is done being a hero. Like his famous Frisbee shield, the desire to do good always comes back. Instead of continuing under the name Captain America, he dons the moniker Nomad, wears a much darker costume that features a deep V-neck, and becomes the man without a country. Sure, this costume might be a little silly to modern eyes. It sort of gives off a disco wing vibe, but this plunging neckline actually serves a purpose. It's an external representation of his internal struggle, where once he had a symbol of his country, Rogers' new costume leaves him bare. Repeatedly throughout his exploits as the Nomad, we see this struggle compounded as Steve appears to be fighting his own history as much as he is his villains. Over and over and over again, Nomad encounters figures from his past and representations of his history. In Captain America number 181, he encounters another character from the 1940s, Namor the Submariner, in front of the Lincoln Memorial. After a brief fight, this figure from Steve's past tells him that whether it's the president or the tides, things always shift. In issues number 180, Nomad confronts the nihilistic Serpent Society in a movie theater showing a film made in tribute to Captain America. While Cap battles valiantly in the background, Nomad struggles in the foreground. As the film's announcer declares, criminals everywhere, on the streets or in high office, trembled at his name. Steve yells back to the screen, "The name's Nomad, Nomad." Reminded of his failure to keep criminals in high office from breaking their oaths, Steve has to reassert his distance from his previous persona. Really, I cannot stress enough, comics are not known for their subtlety. Like America in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, Steve is basically having a full-on identity crisis. Who is he? The idealized man of the past, or the struggling figure of the present? Englehart makes his opinion evident by the end of the fight. As the Cap on screen presumably vanquishes his foes, Nomad trips over his own cape. Ultimately, Steve's tenure as Nomad doesn't last long. Only 4 issues. When one of Steve's greatest enemies from his past, however, the Red Skull, reappears and kills the young man who had taken up the Captain America mantle in his stead, Steve is forced to reckon with the conflict between American past and present that caused him to adopt the Nomad persona in the first place. CA was born in 1941, at a time when the American dream filled all our hearts. From the moment I returned to life in 1964, at the beginning of our Vietnam War, I felt out of my time. The others who acted in America's name were every bit as bad as the Red Skull. Here, Steve explicitly acknowledges the ways in which the events of the past 10 years have changed his understanding of America. Like many Americans, he now recognizes that his country isn't perfect. The country has lofty ideals that it has consistently failed to meet. But the important thing is that the American experiment isn't over, and neither is Steve's speech. Invoking the ideals of America over its reality, he says, "There has to be somebody who'll fight for the dream against any foe." According to Captain America, the American dream isn't a cynical tool to judge reality against. It's an end to aspire to, a goal to fight for. In the darkness of the modern day, Englehart's Cap believes that Americans need to use past ideals to guide them to a way forward. They can't be complacent. They have to fight for America's founding principles against enemies foreign and domestic, whatever the threat, wherever it originates. Now, if we're going to look at Captain America's political history, I think it'd be a mistake to ignore how the writers of modern comics are also engaging with these ideas. They can look at the past and comment on it with the greatest superpower of all, hindsight. Modern writers don't just have to react to Vietnam and Watergate, they can use the character of Captain America to reflect on them. And one way that this is done is by comparing Steve Rogers to one of his foils, the Punisher. Alright, I don't have a Punisher t-shirt, so this Motorhead shirt is the closest you're gonna get. Both born of war, one World War II, one Vietnam, Steve Rogers and Frank Castle have, let's say, complex understandings of America and of each other. Describing the relationship between the two, Cord Scott writes,
"The character of the Punisher represents the antithesis of Captain America, but at the same time represents a darker part of the American psyche. That is the complexity and the meaning of the two characters. Do the Punisher's means justify the end of a safe and secure America?"
If Cap is the dream, Frank Castle, with his love of lethal force, might be closer to our reality. And that's why it's so fascinating to watch their competing visions of the country come to blows in Mark Millar's appropriately named 2006 crossover event, Civil War. I won't get into too much detail here, but the basic idea relevant to our discussion is that there are two warring superhero factions. Rogers and Castle have formed a shaky alliance, but it comes crumbling down when Frank kills two supervillains in cold blood and Captain America attacks. He beats the Punisher to a bloody pulp, all while other heroes watch as the anti-hero accepts the beating and refuses to fight back. After another hero wonders why this was the case, Spider-Man responds, "Are you kidding me? Cap's probably the reason he went to Vietnam. Same guy, different war." Despite Cap's insistence that they're not the same, that Frank Castle is insane, this exchange has stuck in the back of my mind since I read this story for the first time. Sitting in my bedroom at 13 years old, I had to ask, are Cap and the Punisher really the same man, just in different circumstances? If they are, then Millar's stance on American involvement in Vietnam is abundantly clear. The commitment to their country, the patriotism that made Steve Rogers a national hero in World War II, makes Frank Castle a cold-blooded murderer in Vietnam. By placing these seeming opposites in such close proximity, and then drawing out the similarities that lay below the surface, Millar makes us ask the question that even his predecessors at Marvel were afraid to face. Who would Captain America be if he had went to Vietnam? What would he have done? 13 years later, in 2019, Chip Zdarsky answers this question in Spider-Man Life Story. That might seem odd at first, but it actually makes sense. The main question of Spider-Man Life Story is, what if Spider-Man's story started in the 1960s and then progressed in real time, with every issue taking place a decade after the last? It's frankly just a really cool idea for a comic, especially one that uses Marvel characters. Marvel has a sliding timeline, which means that all of its characters are always roughly the same age, no matter how much time progresses out here in the real world. And the big events of their history have always happened at roughly the same time in their past. For our purposes, I think that the most interesting impact of the sliding timescale is that it means that the origins of characters who were originally tied to the Vietnam War, like the Punisher, now happened in the fictional Sian Kong War in Marvel's main continuity. If you're a modern Marvel writer and you don't want to focus on Vietnam, you don't have to. But because of Spider-Man Life Story's central conceit, it has to reckon with Vietnam. And reckon it does. Set in 1966, the first issue of Zdarsky's work is haunted by the specter of war in Vietnam. On the second page, we see a college-age Peter Parker watching an anti-war protest. Later in the book, Flash Thompson enlists in the war effort, and all the while, Peter, in classic Spider-Man fashion, is questioning his responsibility. What is a hero supposed to do about the conflict in Vietnam? Looking for advice, he turns to the original war superhero, Captain America. Cap isn't certain of the country's involvement in Vietnam, but he resolves to go himself in order to take up the role of one who represents the ideals, not the government, of the United States. Then, we don't hear from him until the end of the issue. A year later, we get our first look at the Spectre-made manifest. Our first foray into Vietnam. Mark Bagley's art employs the same 3 thin panels to create an immediate sense of tension and claustrophobia. We watch helpless as American soldiers stalk out of the forest, encounter a group of villagers, and then prepare to murder an innocent woman holding her baby. The panel's short, the words fragmented, it's all moving too fast. The conclusion feels inevitable until, out of nowhere, something knocks out the first soldier. Ricocheting off of him and into the others, our eyes follow the streak across the page until we see what it is. The shield of Captain America. One of the soldiers says that he'd heard Cap had turned traitor, but he hadn't believed it. Cap simply says, "These people, they're under my protection." He's battle-hardened and gruff, but with his shield raised, Steve Rogers is still ever the hero. Zdarsky's message is clear as day. The war in Vietnam was wrong, and anyone who wants to represent America has to recognize that fact. They have to be willing to defend our ideals from anyone who might pervert them. Writing in this way, using Cap in this way, Zdarsky is channeling Steve Englehart and doing what Stan Lee couldn't. He's using the symbolic nature of this character in this medium to take a firm stance against the injustices of the 60s and 70s. At the end of the day, the history of this character lets readers like you and me track how the attitudes of writers, fans, and characters shift over time. But that history also lets us see that no matter their differences of opinion, one thing remained constant between Stan Lee's nostalgia for the past, Steve Englehart's socially conscious writing, and Chip Zdarsky's messaging. Where Captain America goes, and what he does when he gets there, doesn't just reflect on him, but on our entire country. Cap is a political figure, yes, but at his best, he's also an aspirational one. He encourages us to fight for our ideals, to hold ourselves to high moral standards, to be better. Captain America is a great character because he's more than just a man. He's a symbol.